My name is Mona. I'm from Stop Ecocide Germany. And today we will talk about the connection between colonialism and ecocide, which is extremely important because if we think about ecocide, we have to think also about the bigger systemic conditions which enable a behavior like ecocide, which is really destructive behavior, really brutal and really exploitative. And it needs a system also to evolve, which is inherently brutal, destructive, and exploitative. Ulrike?
I'm sorry. Nicht genau.
Okay.
Da ist, okay.
Yeah. And yeah, this was colonialism, but also today we are still living in a system which is still destructive. We are crossing several boundaries, planetary boundaries.
I'm sorry. Please, everybody, shut down your microphone, please.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, we still have colonial structures are still shaping international relationships and our mindsets today. And we also see that ecocide is mainly occurring in the global south. The profit is accumulating in the global north. So it is a really important topic to tackle really this broader systemic conditions in which ecocide is, which enables ecocide on a global level. And for this, I'm really happy to have an expert on board today, Mirinyali Nishinde. And she will talk about a historical case. It's about the actions of the East India Company with regards to the Indian environment. And you're using the current definition of the ecocide law. So yeah, a warm welcome. And you studied in India and you worked also there in environmental and criminal law, for example, for the National Green Tribunal. And you were also a fellow at the Legal Affairs Division in the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You are currently a lecturer for the International Environmental Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Cologne, where you're also enrolled as a PhD student. Also, you're enrolled as a PhD student at the University of Paris. And your research focuses on international environmental law, environmental criminal law, climate change, carbon pricing, carbon taxing, and corporate environmental crime. And next to all this academic stuff, you're also active in for several non-profit projects which address sustainability and climate. So, for example, the Climate Tracker and Student Energy. And yeah, a warm welcome. And we start. And yeah, let's start. And thanks to be here. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Mona. So, hallo. Ich danke Ihnen alles, dass Sie heute hier sind. Mein juristischen Deutsch ist nicht so gut. So, heute unser Webinar ist in English, aber so Entschuldigung. So, yes, so today I will be talking about the histories of ecocide, exploring legal imaginaries of colonial ecocide. So as Mona already explained, I try and draw a nexus between our current understanding of ecocide and its colonial past, especially given the role of the corporation, the corporate vehicle, in perpetrating this sort of environmental harm to communities. And using the example of the English East India Company, which did perpetrate environmental harm in what are now the modern nations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, I look at how we can expand legal imagination to understand colonial ecocide's past in order to inform how we approach its the conversation, its legal status, and of course, finally, legislation and prosecution, as we are all currently discussing in light of the new definition that was put forth by Stop Ecocide. So before we begin, I wanted to do a quick check on how many people have, say, a perfunctory background in law, or, who are coming at it from a non-legal background, because it's really important for our discussion so that I don't, spend too much time on technicalities. But if people would be interested, I would also, be very happy to explain certain technicalities if you are interested. So what we would do is, I think because everyone's videos are off, I can't see if you're raising your hands. I would just ask you to please note down if something is unclear. We will definitely address it in the questions and answers, because maybe I would say something, and if it's not clear, please get back to me later. So now, if you look at the title of my talk, it talks about legal imaginaries of colonial ecocide. And why I use the word imaginaries is because several concepts or thoughts which are currently not, say, into statutory form, or which haven't entered jurisprudence per se, still can exist and inform the law via imagination. And there is a lot of work done on the role of legal imagination in international law and in legal theory, especially within the third world approaches to international law school of thought, where, for example, one of the major Twale scholars, Marty Koskaniemi, in his last book last year, now it's 2 years ago, in 2021, he talks about how the work of the law, so legal work, is in function expanding as the legal imagination expands. So in his book, which is called Uttermost Parts of the Earth, Legal Imagination and International Power, he talks about how legal imaginations form a bricolage, like a combination of materials that are lying around that you can use to persuade those whose opinions and words count. And now this is very important in the context of ecocide, because as today's webinar is being co-organized by Stop Ecocide International, you see there is a lot of effort that goes into convincing those in power to push the law to a certain end. And whether that is the codification of ecocide, whether it is the active implementation of it, there is a lot of convincing and persuasion that takes place in the life of the law. And that is where imagination plays a role, where we decide how we want to conceive our idea of the law. We use history especially to inform that idea. And that is where the role of legal imagination comes into play. So this is just the context and the reason why I use the term legal imaginaries. Now, in light of this legal imagination, what I will try and explain in today's talk is how the actions of the East India Company in the past have led to real world consequences that continue to impact communities and the environment in present day, global South countries. So in light of this, is there a case to be made for colonial ecocide? And if yes, if we do imagine that, the modern concept of ecocide would include harm that has been perpetrated previously, how do we end up codifying that? How do we end up getting justice for those harms? And because obviously we have based on past actions if such a law didn't exist at the time. So everyone is subject to the legal system that they operate in. However, we have seen instances of reparations being used, right? So if you look at examples from apartheid South Africa, we've seen settlement claims being made by communities against corporations who engaged in apartheid, who supported apartheid, and they have made out cash settlements in favor of those communities. So while necessarily it doesn't mean that a company or a country would be prosecuted under criminal law for ecocide that was committed in the past, we can expand our understanding of harm in a way that we can demand accountability for it, that the people who have suffered that kind of harm have a voice in deciding how and what justice looks like for them, right? And that kind of discussion that would then inform acknowledgement and settlement is important. Now, in this context, I want to talk about the East India Company. So the English East India Company, I don't know how many people are familiar with their work. So the English East India Company was incorporated by charter. It was a joint stock company, and it was public, but with partial state ownership. So it was granted a royal charter by Elizabeth I in 1606. So over 400 years ago. And it was granted to the Earl of Cumberland and 215 others to form a corporate body. And they were to trade in the East Indies, so in the Indian subcontinent. And they were granted a 15-year monopoly to trade in the East Indies with financial and military support of England. Now, this is very important because we see how, so it has access to the state's military resources, right? So this is where we see the corporate body and the state coming together, especially in the dispersal of state functions, such as the use of the military. The charter also allowed the East India Company to make their own coins and exercise law and order, provide justice in its own overseas settlements. And it gave the EIC the power to wage war as necessary, right? So even though it was made for the primary purpose of trade, you see how the state transferred its state functions into act on its behalf, including with the use of military power abroad in order to facilitate that trade, right? And then you see that the East India Company started trading. Then it also combined forces with different rulers in India till it reached the Treaty of Allahabad that was signed in 1765, which allowed the East India Company to directly collect taxes from citizens in India. That was in Bengal, Bihar, and other states. And this further expansion of state functions to a corporation was what allowed English colonialism to prosper in the Indian subcontinent. So much so that the East India Company in the late 1700s also engaged in corporate lobbying in the parliament, right? So there is evidence of the fact that the East India Company resisted attempts by the British Parliament to hold them accountable, and they also supported the opposition against this bill that would have greater oversight over them. So you also see evidence in around 1780s that it acted like a true corporation in a profit-making corporation, in how it lobbied the parliament and king in order to reduce its accountability. So in light of this nature of this corporation, in its activities and its actions till it was taken over by the British Parliament after the rebellion, when it came under the crown and the East India Company was dissolved and Queen Victoria took over as Empress of India in 1858 under the Government of India Act. You see that they had to perpetrate several different kinds of environmental harm in order to pursue their profit. Now, this is where we come back to the present and look at the definition that the expert panel has proposed under Stop Ecocide International. So that came out in June 2021. So right now, the definition states that ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, if we were to take a moment and imagine that ecocide as a crime had existed in the 1600s, okay, just as a thought experiment. Of course, none of our very commonly held principles of, like, say, private law existed then as much as, and it's especially in their current form. But if we just imagine that, that if this was the law, a lot of the actions that were taken by the East India Company would fall under the definition of ecocide. Basically, and why is it a problem? Because, of course, the definition includes the term unlawful. So back then, because there was no law of ecocide, of course, it was not unlawful. But for that moment, if we ignore the unlawful aspect of it and imagine that, we had thought about ecocide in the 1600s, the idea that wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and widespread or long-term damage to the environment is a possibility within the realm of the English East India Company, right? Because the main idea was profit. And by wanton, the definition, as the panel has mentioned, is wanton means with reckless disregard for damage, which could be excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. Now, I personally have reservations about this definition already that the expert panel came about, because I personally don't think that, the reckless disregard for damage in excess of social and economic benefits is an adequate definition. I think if there are economic and social benefits of environmental damage, they should still be evaluated much, much more harshly if it means that the environment will be harmed. But again, we're not discussing the definition itself. Assuming that this definition would have applied, you see that the East India Company was quite active in perpetrating environmental harm, as is envisioned by the definition. And so I'm going to give you a few examples of where I think this could have applied. Just few examples of which historic accounts exist, and a lot of ethnographic research exists about the daily experiences that current communities faced because of the consequences of past actions, and also historic records that document that these decisions were made in the past, right? So one example is the destruction of India's wildlife resources, right? So if you see a lot of paintings and pictures of the English East India Company and the British government in India, there's a lot of representation of royals and dignitaries being photographed, standing next to big carcasses of dead tigers, elephants, like a successful conquering of Indian nature, sort of as taming like a savage, condition. Like, so it was like a symbol of control of British imperial masculine strength during the 19th century. So if you were to document the number of important apex species that were lost by India's forests to satisfy, this wanton disregard for the environment, as the definition would call it, then we would find several instances of, the origins of this harm. Same applies to deforestation. Now, unlike the animals, which were often like for game and for pursuit, the destruction of forests had a huge economic consequence, right? So the use of forest timber to expand the railways in order to further transport coal, that led to introduction of forest laws in India, where India's forests were no longer forests for biodiversity or for public use, but they were labeled as reserve forests. So it was the government's reserve to use as they wanted. So the teak forests were also responsible for helping Britain's maritime expansion, so for shipbuilding in the Napoleonic Wars, especially the Forest Act of 1865, it created a state monopoly over acquiring and growing timber in those areas which were great for obtaining railway supplies. And this led to a lot of destruction of not only biodiverse forests, but it also intruded upon traditional property rights of communities. And the rural communities who had lived in those forests were then subject to penalties and criminal law for existing in those forests, right? So they also lost a lot of their right to the forest, not only the biodiversity itself, again, in the pursuit of profit via the railway expansion. And along with rights to a forest land, there were also destruction of eco-cultural rights of the tribal communities. So those communities that lived in the forests had been rather, politically autonomous before, where they lived on their own, with their customary law within the forest areas. But as soon as the Forest Acts came into play in 1865, 78, 1927, those laws criminalized several of essential forest functions that these communities depended on, such as gathering forest produce, grazing, cultivation in small land holdings, where there was customary rights and occupations before. And this then led to an increase in them having to become indentured laborers. And they were often also forced to migrate to, not even migrate, they were essentially dragged to plant, let's not call it migrate, it's far too sanitized a word, but they were forced to work in plantations in as far as Mauritius or Guyana, right? British Guyana. So, and that also leads to a loss of cultural and eco-cultural rights. Further, loss of diets based on the forest that used to be more resistant to famine and drought created disturbance in the food cycle. So they were further subjected to instances of famine. So another example for just for reference is that, when in the Sundarbans, which is the low-lying tidal mangrove forests between West Bengal in India and Bangladesh, these tidal mangrove forests are very low-lying, but because they have very fertile soil in this Indo-Gangetic Delta, the English East India Company decided to reclaim that land and make smaller land structures within the swamp, which changed the drainage system entirely. And they tried to use temporary solutions like embankments, sluices, that has resulted in some sort of permanent malfunctioning of the hydrological system in this area. And this area continues to suffer from high instances of floods and destitution every time there is a larger volume of water flowing through the rivers. And that it has some origin and attribution to the actions of the land reclamation in the Sundarbans. Now, a last example that I wanted to share with you is that during the British expansion in the Indian subcontinent and across the world, there was several attempts to, introduce exotic species, invasive species. So they would get something from another colony on a different continent and mix plants into different ecosystems that led to a lot of native species, wild forests being destroyed by the alien, harmful, invasive species. And such as, say, for example, the Lantana camara plant, which is very popularly seen in India, is actually an invasive species. And it often destroys coffee plantations, and it has a lot of economic consequence because of the way it spread, especially because the traditional forests were being cut down for railways, and that allowed invasive species to enter and take up that space. And this sort of destruction of environmental resources was common. Now, we don't know if the science then was, strong enough for them to have known what they were doing, of course. But then it begs the question, the most fundamental question of all, that they had no business being there in the first place, right? And rewilding India or introducing new species. So that regard that you would have in being in someone else's home. And we have to keep remembering that in all of this economic activity, this was economic activity that was perpetrated through war, through military control, through expansionist imperial ideas. So it had these environmental consequences. Now, in light of all of these examples, I'm sure there are several dozens more that have been studied by scientists much more knowledgeable than me, especially anthropologists, historians, environmental historians. But where I'm looking at it in my work is to look at how this can impact the discourse on reparations. So you know that Germany as well is right now undergoing a public discussion on reparations of colonialism, starting with a very fundamental act of returning stolen goods back to their homes of origin. And whether or not this will have any legal impact in terms of codification of environmental harms is unclear at this point. But if we were to think of it in the context of ecocide, and you see that there has been harm committed and that current generations continue to suffer from this harm, then that opens up a possibility, because of our legal imagination, to have some sort of conversation and acknowledgement that this harm was made, and to look at how these wrongs can be righted, especially through binding settlements. Right now, we have already in the Caribbean, the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which deals with this. UK law itself recognizes that there is something like a victim personal statement in criminal cases, where the victim discusses how the crime harmed them, and that would hopefully impact the decision of the jury or the judge, etc. So we have a culture of acknowledging the harm that is done to victims, and then that would enable a more just outcome. And I feel that there is a possibility to have this conversation in the context of environmental harm as well. So, for example, in Germany, there is an example of this, right? So you have the Stiftung EWZ, so the law that came into force in 2000 through the law on the creation of the EWZ Foundation, where there is payment offered to those who were victims, who were subject to, and also the descendants of those who suffered from the Holocaust. Now, the question is whether a similar fund can be created by the current United Kingdom and the British monarchy for its colonies as reparation, and not as aid or grants or loans. So if you're giving something as charity or aid, it still maintains that power imbalance. Whereas what I'm arguing for is that there has to be a very strong acknowledgement of harm that was perpetrated. And remember, the British monarchy is quite responsible as well, because the charter of the English East India Company, it allowed for the British monarch and their descendants to benefit from the profits of the English East India Company. So it's not just the government of the United Kingdom, but more importantly, it's also the institution of the monarchy itself, because this company was created by royal charter. And their descendants are still around very famously, as we keep seeing in social media and in the news cycle. So, what is the role that they play in this acknowledgement also is an important question. And if you look at ecocide again, we want to introduce ecocide as an additional crime under the Rome Statute, right? Under the definition, at least as proposed by Stop Ecocide International. Now, within the Rome Statute, we know that there is only jurisdiction over natural persons. So under Article 25, that the court will only prosecute a person who commits a crime within the jurisdiction of the court, who is an individual responsible and liable. And the question of corporate liability under the Rome Statute is currently still, not possible as a legal person, which is the corporation, but we can, of course, hold persons within the corporation responsible, but not the entire company itself, right? Because there was discussion on this. So when the Rome Statute was being discussed and before it was adopted, the proposal to include corporate liability was rejected because there is lack of complementarity for jurisdictions, right? So there is not all countries in the world recognize corporate liability. So the lack of commonly agreed standards for corporate crime led to us having only individual criminal liability in the Rome Statute. So this again raises the question for us for ecocide, because you look at how we have evidence of how the East India Company operated with support of the state, and it perpetrated these crimes. So it is difficult to necessarily find one individual who, commits a crime like ecocide. It is a culture of corporate, negligence, of being driven for profit. And it's often not just one person who is responsible for committing it. Now, of course, we have the idea of command responsibility in international criminal law, like whoever was the commander in charge and who should have known better is therefore held responsible, that anything that happens under their command. But the question is, does the same idea of command responsibility apply to corporate crime if we were to include it? Because there is plenty of jurisprudence showing how corporations as entities tend to have a corporate culture of negligence. A lot of research in organizational behavior has shown that there are corporate cultures that are criminogenic, that enable this culture of environmental harm or other sorts of criminal activities, usually fraud or tax evasion as well, right? So again, I'm ending with a lot of questions that we should be asking and answering, hopefully, when it comes to introducing ecocide to the Rome Statute, that still currently seem unclear, and we don't know how they will pan out if we do indeed amend the Rome Statute. But the good thing is that the Rome Statute has provisions for reparations. So the International Criminal Court, for example, has a trust fund for victims where it's based on reparative justice. It is based for the benefit of victims for the crimes under the court and their families. And so it can be, and the court can seize money through fines or forfeiture in order to supply money to this trust fund. So this could be perhaps a way where ecocide then can rely on a trust fund for victims in order to get justice for environmental crime committed by corporations as well. So it's not just who we hold responsible, but also who benefits and how justice is performed when it comes to ecocide. So it's important to make these connections across centuries. So not just in the past, but also not to stay just in the present, and to see how these events talk to each other to create a much stronger vision for corporate accountability. And also to, there is an obligation for us to act based on our memory and not to, act without acknowledgement of the past harms, where, especially in a time where corporations continue to acquire more power in emerging markets. So that's all for me for today. And I'm very interested in listening to your questions, and hopefully I have answers for them as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mrinalini. Wow, this was really impressive. Yeah, I always think about how the world would look like if we didn't have the area of colonialism, and how communities would look like, and the biodiversity, and yeah. Okay, so I think you talk, for sure there are a lot of questions. I would say we open the discussion, no? And yeah, just unmute yourself and pose your question.
Yeah, I guess if you can use the raise hand function in Zoom.
Ah, yes, true. Yeah, yeah.
I know this wasn't a hard law presentation where I give facts and a conclusion, but it's because the nature of the topic is such that I myself have still many questions left to answer. But yeah, I hope we can all think about these questions together. Any questions?
Until now, I don't see any hands. Yeah, just ask, really, because it's nothing worse than thinking later, oh, I wanted to know this and didn't ask it. So yeah, but maybe I start one. So I'm not I don't have a background in law, so it will be more a more broad question. So I don't know if you can answer that or not. But I always think like colonialism as the origin of ecocide. Is this what is your? I mean, it might be more an opinion, but what do you think about this theory?
I wouldn't say colonialism is necessarily the origin of ecocide. I think colonialism was definitely the origin of, industrialized capital expansion, and which often involved destruction of the environment. And this is where our favorite German intellectual comes into play, a certain Mr. Karl Marx, where he talks about how the expansion of capitalist modes of production involved not only the destruction of labor rights and of workers, but also of the soil itself, the environment. So that's where his Marx's idea of materialism in the context of environmentalism comes into play, where he says how both of these coexisted. And he actually, because he was writing in the 1800s, the East India Company was operating in real time when he was writing. So there's actually a really good quote by him in his article in the New York Daily Tribune, where Marx says that, there cannot be any doubt but that the misery inflicted by the British on Hindustan is of an essentially different and infinitely more intensive kind than all of Hindustan had to suffer before. I do not allude to European despotism planted upon Asiatic despotism by the British East India Company, forming a more monstrous combination than any of the divine monsters startling us in the Temple of Salsette. This is no distinctive feature of British colonial rule, but only an imitation of the Dutch. So as you know, that there was the Dutch East India Company that already existed before the English East India Company came into action. And you see how the idea that you have to expand the corporation and its profits in a colonial project, that involved the destruction of the environment. So the idea was still, I think, like a Marxist critique is best suited to understanding how it led to ecocide, because I think the goal was never to commit like environmental harm. It was just a very easy consequence of the ultimate goal of profit. And that is where the ecocide definition is very interesting, because the ecocide definition says, talks about wanton disregard for the environment. And that is what I think happened, where there wasn't any regard for the environment of foreign people, because the idea was always expansion. And it's not like rulers before the English East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, Indian rulers were not necessarily very environmental loving or very protective of their resources. They also hunted, they also used forest for whatever purposes they want to build grand palaces. That was the idea of having a feudal royal system where laborers were exploited, resources were exploited. But when you combine this with a military profit-making corporation, it's where you have this compounding effect and a J curve of environmental destruction. And this is my opinion again. So there's no necessarily confirmation of this in theory, but this is my understanding to your question, Mona.
Thanks. Thanks. So we have also one hand from Lizzie.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed the first 15 minutes of your presentation. I have a kind of broad question. Last week, I listened to the concept of from Naomi Klein waste zone, and also her, if I understood it right, her one of her thesis is that the climate justice problem, whether it's addressed in a way that could be a solution, that a lot of climate movements in the global north do not want to address racism and colonialism, or such a concept like sacrifice zones, where it's people, nature, and biodiversity, whatever you need for your profit. So and to leave this aside, to do something, but not address colonialism or racism, but that she is saying it's not possible. The solution will not be possible because it's the root. Well, and I would like to know what you think of her concept and what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think, so I'm not as pessimistic. I try not to say things like, this is not going to ever happen, because then if we know that for a fact, then all our, activism and our hope then is lost. So I wouldn't say, that it's not possible, but I do agree with her conceptually in the sense that whether or not, if you follow the negotiations, if you follow public discussions, even if you follow like the European Union, there is a very rare instance where wealthy nations acknowledge the role of colonialism in their wealth. And I'm not just talking through like, British English East India Company or, the Dutch East India Company or something, but it's also about the continued extraction of resources in their previous colonies through modern corporations, especially through fossil fuel corporations, right? So there are very few political leaders, governments, or even citizens willing to admit that, we have benefited and we enjoy the lifestyle we do because of the sins of our past. And it's very similar to this idea, right? That a lot of people think that, when they are rich or when they're wealthy in their daily life, they think it's because they worked really hard. And they think because they have great self-discipline, that they studied really hard, they worked really hard, and that they are working so many hours a week, which is why they're wealthy. And it just simply does not like compute, because there are people who work 80, 90 hours a week who don't even make a fraction of what a standard European 40-hour worker makes, right? So the idea that hard work makes you wealthy is based on the ignorance of your lifestyle and your circumstances that led you to a certain level of comfort. And that also then you can extrapolate to nations where there is very little acknowledgement and recognition, okay, that everything we are enjoying, and including me now as a global South scholar, living and working in a global North country, I also, all my lifestyle, my comforts are a direct benefit of European colonial expansion. So that acknowledgement till is like, drilled into everyone's like consciousness, and that will then impact how we spend money, how we treat immigration, including like climate immigration, how we protect each other from climate catastrophe. It's just, it is impossible, as Naomi Klein says, without that acknowledgement. Now, whether that acknowledgement can happen is really, for the next generation of parents to inculcate into their children. We need a new generation of wealthy countries' citizens who understand where that wealth is coming from.
Thanks. So there's another hand, Angie. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, this is not so much of a question, but just to add on that, I mean, I feel like ecocide could be used to prosecute post-colonial elites. After the colonial government left, essentially the state was sort of left to sort of minority who sort of took dominance over the majority who are still not benefiting from economically or in terms of their livelihood. So last week, I think we were talking about the case of Bolsonaro. He was one of those figures whom I would consider like colonial elites, that he was from some sort of probably European background. He was German, I forgot. But anyhow, he had carried on what the colonial government had historically do and sort of justify himself that he was simply pushing for progress. And I mean that this is not uniquely to Brazil, as much as I think this happens in Kenya, which was also it was run by the British. But then when the British left, the president, who was President Mao, I forgot his name. And I think he has also taken up the role of colonial government. I'm not too sure about what the case is in India. I mean, has this happened? I mean, after the British...
So the Forest Acts that I mentioned in the presentation, so a lot of those Forest Acts continued to, at least in, in its basic structure, continue in post-independence India as well. Now, thankfully, we've had several amendments and new acts that further safeguarded the rights of local communities especially. But the damage was already done because the legal system that was created and adopted by post-colonial India is very similar to how the lens of, having this reserve forest, having state control, the creation of the Indian Forest Service as a civil service to guard India's forests, all those systems and structures continued. And I think it's also very true regarding post-colonial elites in the Indian subcontinent as well, where, just because a country is now independent, it does not mean that it is no longer beholden to a corporate capital interest. It's just that the nationality of the actors may change, or these corporations even might be headquartered in other countries. But we see very often that there is still the idea that large corporations are given preference when it comes to access to natural resources compared to the citizens. And that is why Marx's critique comes into play, then where we cannot just think of it from a global north-south country-based identity, but it also matters what the other identities are at the local level in terms of, say, caste hierarchies, class hierarchies, access to capital, and you cannot dismiss these identities. So I actually try and be as far away from this very reductive idea of global north and global south countries, because even within the global south countries, so as to say, there is a huge reckoning to be made between the different powers, because there are some powers that benefited massively from colonialism as well in the global south. So local actors who were close to the company, who traded with the company, and therefore also benefited from colonialism. And so that internal reckoning is also very much necessary and simultaneously. But yeah, as far as like the prosecution of elites goes, I'm really curious how the Rome Statute, especially with the new ecocide definition, would play out, or especially given that a lot of the countries of the world, all of them are not parties to the Rome Statute, right? So really we'll see how it ends up being entering into criminal law. But Angie, I totally agree with your point.
I mean, it was very challenging because last week I think we were talking about I think Bolsonaro was sort of killing people from the Yanomami, the Amazon indigenous people. He was sort of replicating what happened in sort of colonial history. But then again, these people had to go to the Brazil court and say the court does nothing about it, and then they could probably to go to the international court. I don't know how these details work, and the law is not there yet. So at the moment, it's pretty not great. But yeah, I'm certainly hopeful that it will sort of become a law that can actually protect, the indigenous peoples and the forest and the ongoing destruction. But yeah. Great.
Thank you so much for that really important question, Angie.
Thank you. Lizzie? Okay.
If there's nobody else, I would. I have two questions. The ecocide concept, whether to bring it forward, do you think that the colonial concept of terra nullius, that there's just land, there's nobody there, it's there for us, must be, I don't know, to do something with it, that it's necessary to somehow? That's one question. And the other question is about time frame. Because when people talk about ecocide, often the time reference is in the Industrial Revolution, but mustn't the time frame be much longer, like to include the colonial times also?
So as our, I'll answer your second question first. So as our current state of criminal law is, right, like in almost every jurisdiction, it's very difficult to prosecute criminally actions that took place before a criminal law was introduced. Now, this is, I think, in accordance with, just like fairness and justice. But however, like prosecution under criminal law is not the only outcome, right, in environmental justice. So which is why I wanted to mention this idea of settlement-based reparations, where you have negotiations, where you have like acknowledgement of harm, and where there are retroactive payouts. For that, you're not then limited by criminal law and prosecution rules of procedure. So that would be my answer to your second question. And for the first question regarding terra nullius, now, I mean, it's such an awful concept in the first place. And I mean, just everything that has been done in the name of terra nullius, right, historically, it's I mean, it's in our current idea of justice, of the law, it's quite, shameful that this was how customary international law operated when it did, especially when it came to the European colonization of the Americas. But I don't think that this really applies in the context, especially of the East India Company, because, I mean, they were all established states, right? There was like very strong territories that existed within the Indian subcontinent of different kingdoms. So I don't think the terra nullius concept applies here. And I think it's just such an awful idea to begin with that I don't see it like, really impacting the ecocide discussion so much, because it was used also very selectively in the past. So even to justify colonization. So I don't think in the context of, defense of colonization or in the defense of ecocide, it's the same like idea that, we shouldn't be held responsible for actions committed in another time. This idea that, it was another time, different things were acceptable. Now, when we think of ecocide, it's very much that, okay, this environment was destroyed and people and the ecosystem are still suffering because of those actions. So how are we going to fix that? And whether it's through acknowledgement, money, or performance, I don't know. So that is where the reparations and settlements come into play. We have one more question, I think.
Yes,
Last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. I was just wondering, I mean, sometimes we hear the claim that very many of the sustainability initiatives and likewise, they have, you can say, a very heavy weight to be global north centered. And maybe voices from the South are missing in these discussions, and maybe you can say the definitions and the outcomes of many things are actually very much colored by the North. So I was just wondering, even though the expert panel has been an international panel with experts from all over, I was just wondering, I mean, in your opinion, is that also something that you can see in the definition of the proposed definition of ecocide and the entire discussion around ecocide? Is that also, can that also seen as an asymmetrical discussion?
Yeah, so thank you. I think that's a great last question, actually, because this is the core of what my doctoral research talks about, essentially, that, you know, with the current definition of ecocide, is there something that we already have that we can use to achieve similar aims in domestic law, and how and why the ecocide definition will add value to our existing legislation? So my reservation about the current definition is not the definition so much itself. I think it's a very well drafted definition, but the procedural aspects of having ecocide as a crime under the International Criminal Court, that is what I have reservations about, because focusing all our energies into you know, ensuring that the crime of ecocide enters the ICC is slightly, I think, limiting the scope of what we should be doing with ecocide, given that several important countries from an ecocide perspective are not parties to the Rome Statute, right? So it's unclear at this point to imagine how it will impact their legislation, how it will impact you know, the law, because you don't have to be a party to the Rome Statute for you to change law in order to make sure that you're not, you know, not in compliance with it, etc. And this is especially true for ecocide, because there might be companies that are headquartered in some countries but operating in other countries. So it remains to be seen how effective it will be in jurisdictions which are not parties to the Rome Statute. And the second thing, again, is limiting it to individual criminal responsibility. So we have to still wait and watch how it will be, you know, like impacting corporate entities and who will be held responsible. And the third thing is also that if we have the ICC, which depends so heavily on the discretion of the office of the prosecutor, how many cases would actually be, you know, prosecuted given the constraints of time that are that exist? Which is why the one good thing that might be immediate from the introduction of ecocide is that countries would be forced to have legislation on their rule books that also criminalizes ecocide. So if you're a party to the Rome Statute, then if ecocide were to be a crime under the Rome Statute, parties to the Rome Statute would also have to have that crime to show that they are able and willing to prosecute it domestically, so that it wouldn't even reach the International Criminal Court. So this I see is a major benefit from it. But the definition per se, I think, is quite, you know, well thought out, and I think it does a good job of incorporating all the different like capital critiques of capital that exist right now in the environmental justice movement. The only thing I have reservations about is this, you know, definition of what is a wanton, which says that, you know, it has to be reckless disregard for damage, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. Now, this does open the door for a lot of parties arguing that because economic benefit was necessary, therefore the regard for the environment can be balanced out and therefore not considered as wanton disregard. And I think that language opens up the possibility for it to be diluted and weakening of the definition. But the people who have drafted it are some of the best in the business. So I'm sure they have their reasons for it. And I'm sure there was plenty of discussion and negotiation that went into deciding the final language. However, my fear is of being far too, putting far too much hope into the International Criminal Court as an institution. But for me, the hope in the ecocide definition lies in the fact that all the parties to the Rome Statute would then introduce ecocide law onto their legislation, that is definitely a strong positive outcome that we should be hoping for.
But could you see an alternative? To instead of ICC, would there be any other possibility?
I mean, we do have, international criminal law also as part of the UNGA resolutions, for instance. And I think the ICC is one part of a really big puzzle, but I feel like the discussion on ecocide, because say all the European Union member states are all parties to the ICC, it tends to be conflated that, okay, that if this would be an ICC crime, then therefore the EU would have to fall in line, and therefore it's a great thing. And it is for the EU. But now the United States is not a party. So India is not a party. China is not a party. So I think it might be not the best use of limited public attention and resources to focus entirely on only amending the ICC. But I don't see it as at all as a bad first step. I think it's a great first step, but that cannot be the end goal.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think this was our last question. Yes. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the questions. And thank you for this talk, Nalini. I really like this method to use the history and connect it to current situations. And yeah, I think it was a great talk and eye-opener. And I hope that there is something happening in regard to this current connections between colonialism and ecocide. And yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I think this was from us. And I posted our campaign for the EU, because they are deciding now on the new environmental law thing. I posted in the chat, so if you want to sign. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was a pleasure. Really great questions, everyone. It's going to make me think for a bit now this evening before I go to bed. So thanks for that. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you.